Krivax closed the book on Dalaran's laws as soon as he finished reading the portions on magical duels and moved to return it to the bookshelf filled with recently purchased books that Hadix thought would be useful for his students' continued education. Call him paranoid, but while Hadix might be confident that he was more than capable of handling anything that came his way, Krivax wanted to learn everything he could beforehand. Apparently, magical dueling was a tradition that had been brought to Dalaran from Quel'Thalas, unsurprisingly, and was a method that mages sometimes used to settle disagreements. It made sense to Krivax, in a society that had access to potent magical healing and powerful arcane defenses, fighting to prove a person's magical competence or to resolve a feud would naturally be more common than on Earth. Especially given the fact that Azeroth was an extremely dangerous place, which naturally led to cultures and people that were generally more hostile, combative, and martial-focused than Earth. Of course, there was a bit of bureaucracy involved in scheduling a magical duel that had taken them 2 days to arrange. Both of the participants had to go in front of an official and give their consent by signing a contract stating the terms of the duel. There was also a hefty fee to pay for the facilities and all of the supporting personnel, which Flame Trail had insisted on paying in full due to some kind of cultural expectations placed on the challenger, but the duel itself was a relatively straightforward matter. The duel would take place in a venue prepared for such occasions, a small stadium that would allow interested parties to watch. Both of the participants would be protected by the stadium's numerous defensive enchantments, and there would be mages and healers ready to intervene as soon as things looked to be going wrong, but there otherwise were few rules other than to non-lethally defeat your opponent in magical combat. There was a rule that prohibited the usage of magical items, which Krivax had worried would extend to spell weaving, but an administrator had ensured him it didn't after learning what spell weaving was. The fact that spell weaving reserved a portion of the caster's mana and only imbued magic into silk temporarily put it into the same category as protection spells that were crafted beforehand. It was much closer to pre-casting a spell than permanently enchanting an item. As long as both participants were informed of the situation, then spell weaving didn't break any rules. When Arcanist Flametrail was made aware that Hadix would be spell weaving, he hadn't seemed to care, and Hadix was more than willing to take advantage of that arrogance. "I still don't understand why that elf would be dumb enough to challenge you," said Krivax, huffing in frustration. "Didn't you make it abundantly clear that you outclass him, Vizier Hadix?" The Vizier was hanging from one of the webs attached to the wall of their assigned lodgings while weaving a spell far more complex than Krivax could understand into a long strand of silk. He wasn't even done with his spell weaving yet, but the silk already glowed with an unreasonable amount of arcane energy. "There's a possibility this scenario was arranged by the city's leadership in order to test my abilities. If that is the case, then this is an acceptable outcome because it will allow me to show some of what we are capable of, but the most likely explanation is simply that people often make irrational decisions," said Hadix as he prepared himself for the coming duel. "That is especially true when they are highly emotional. Besides, if our historical records on the elves remain accurate, making detrimental decisions due to their own arrogance is a feature inherent to their species." Krivax very carefully did not react to that hypocritical statement as he watched Hadix continue his spell weaving. "Humph. Don't think that I don't know what's going on in that odd little mind of yours," said Hadix, huffing in amusement. "Arrogance is only arrogance when it is undeserved. Otherwise, it's simply having a good understanding of one's capabilities. The difference between me and that elf is that unlike him, my understanding of myself in comparison to others is accurate." "I have no idea what you're talking about, Vizier Hadix," said Krivax, trying his best to keep a straight face and sound as genuine as possible. "I was not thinking anything derogatory about you at all. I see that those lessons I gave you in how to properly lie have had some effect," Hadix said dryly, turning his attention away from his weaving to glance at him. "Perhaps if you continue practicing for a few decades, you might become a skilled enough liar to make me second-guess myself." "Yes, Vizier Hadix, I have no idea why I thought you were arrogant. How odd of me. So you're certain that there's no possibility that you will lose?" Krivax asked curiously. While he had studied under Hadix for a significant amount of time by now, he did not actually know that much about his mentor. Krivax knew that Hadix was more powerful than the average vizier, but he didn't know how powerful that was, nor had he actually seen a full-on battle between two fully mature mages. Ignoring the potential diplomatic headaches that this might cause him in the future, Krivax was actually feeling a bit excited to watch the duel. What kind of person wouldn't want to watch a fight between two wizards? Certainty does not exist when it comes to a fight between two mages, Haedix said firmly. There's every possibility that I will lose, although that remains exceedingly unlikely. Krivax was surprised by the vizier's answer. He had expected the vizier to say something like, "Don't insult me by asking ridiculous questions, Vizier Krivax. That pathetic elf couldn't harm me if he lived for another millennium." "That isn't the answer that I was expecting to hear," Krivax said honestly, curious to hear the vizier's perspective. "There are many among the circle of viziers who would have given you an answer more similar to the one I suspect you were expecting," said Vizier Haedix, his tone uncharacteristically solemn and his gaze far off. "But that is merely because they lack experience in actual combat. There were many times throughout the years that I have seen members of the Order die to those under the sway of the Void, even when the enemy was weaker than them. In combat, anything is possible, and that is why it is wise to deal with your enemies quickly and quietly or avoid a fight whenever possible." Krivax wasn't quite sure what to think about that. It certainly wasn't what he had been expecting from the vizier. "If that is the case, then why did you antagonize that elf and accept his request to duel?" "Because, Krivax, aside from the fact that his incompetence offended my sensibilities, there is very little that irritates me more than a teacher who fails to take their responsibilities seriously, especially one who teaches magic," Haedix hissed out, his tone filled with anger simply at the thought of it. "If a mage agrees to teach the next generation, then there should be a minimal expectation that they do not sabotage their students through either incompetence or disinterest." Krivax paused as he stared at his mentor, considering what the vizier had just said. For all of the time that he had known Haedix, he always considered him to be relatively uncaring about most matters of morality. Oh, he knew that Haedix wasn't some kind of monster that trampled over people for no reason, but he also knew that the vizier didn't have the slightest qualms about getting his hands dirty if he needed to. The fact that Haedix felt strongly about this topic was not something that Krivax had expected. Even if he did care about the sanctity of the teacher-student relationship, Krivax wouldn't have expected him to get so riled up about it. Although looking back, his mentor had always treated matters of his education seriously. From the moment that Krivax had first come under the vizier's tutelage, he had never failed to answer his questions on magic with relative patience. If Krivax wanted to learn something and Haedix was busy, then he was always provided with an appropriate spellbook, which were all fairly valuable, or Haedix would get back to him later. He also acted responsibly with the other members of the Surface World Research Division as far as Krivax could tell. To him, that just seemed like common decency, but he could also remember hearing examples of viziers treating those under them with much less decency during his time in Kilokuk. He was a bit curious about how strongly the vizier felt on this topic, and he could tell that Haedix was lost in his thoughts and wasn't paying him very much attention, so he decided to see if he could learn more. "Well, I suppose I should be grateful that Arcanist Flametrail is simply incompetent," said Krivax, keeping his tone casual. "I doubt I want to know what you would have done if he'd been sabotaging his students intentionally." Haedix's expression immediately grew menacing enough that Krivax felt a shiver of dread go through his carapace. "No, you do not." The vizier's tone was dark enough that Krivax abandoned any intentions to probe Haedix further. Though he had gotten used to the vizier's dominating presence, he still wasn't brave enough to dip his mandibles into what looked like a personal subject. Seeing that Haedix was in no mood for further conversation, Krivax decided that it would be a good idea to bury himself in his spellbooks until it was time for them to leave in a few hours. Elder Vizier Malab's advanced ward of mental protection was much more difficult to learn than Krivax had initially hoped, so most of his recent efforts were dedicated to learning the Order's anti-divination magics. Soon enough, one of the delegation's warriors was knocking on the door and informing them that the venue had been prepared for the duel. The walk to the stadium was a quiet one, although Krivax could feel his excitement growing as they made their way through the streets of Dalaran and grew closer to the stadium. When they reached their destination, a large building not too far from the Violet Citadel, the two of them were quickly ushered in separate directions by a few guards. Haedix was escorted to a preparation room and Krivax found himself being taken to the seating arrangements prepared for him and Vizier Krenus, which was in fact just a section of the stadium stands that was filled with large cushions. It wasn't exactly easy to make a chair for a Nerubian after all, so Krivax supposed this was the best that they could figure out. I guess they must be pretty comfortable, at least because Vizier Krenas is looking pretty cozy." The female vizier looked more than a little pleased, laying down on a large cushion and reading through her notes. Krenas had taken it upon herself to learn more about Dalaran and their government over the past few days in preparation for their important meeting with the Council of Six. Krivax had noticed a marked increase in respect for Dalaran from the viziers in comparison to the amount of respect they had for everyone else in the Eastern Kingdoms. Krivax greeted the vizier and moved over to his own cushion nearby, folding his legs under himself and lowering his body as his warrior escorts, including Masruk, took defensible locations nearby while doing their best to remain unobtrusive. Krivax had wanted to chat with Masruk while watching the fight, but the warrior in charge of his protective escort made it clear that he couldn't spare his friend while Vizier Hadix and Anuba Khan were away. It was fine for his friend to hang out with him while they had the overpowered Vizier or Spider Lord by their side, but when that wasn't the case, Masruk needed to spend more time doing his guard duty and less time making conversation. It wasn't ideal, but Krivax understood the necessity. There would be plenty more opportunities for them to chat when it was more appropriate to do so. "Oh, I like this." The moment he sat down, Krivax was immediately surprised to find that the cushions were enchanted. He wasn't exactly sure what spell it was enchanted with, but he could tell that it was supernaturally comfortable, warming, and contouring itself to his body just the perfect amount. It wasn't as good as a well-made cocoon blanket, but it was still really nice. God, I love magic. It almost makes it worth it to be reborn in a death world that's facing multiple future apocalypses. After taking a few minutes to enjoy the cushion, Krivax decided to take a look around the stadium to see if he could see anyone else that he recognized. After all, he was certain that there were more than a few important people who would be interested in watching Vizier Hadix participate in a duel. There were many people in the stadium, mages and non-mages alike, most having likely come to see the newcomer take on the home team as it were, including several important-looking individuals who were wearing emblems of the Kirin Tor on their robes, but nobody that Krivax recognized. Unfortunately, just because he was familiar with some of Dalaran's most important members due to his meta-knowledge, that didn't mean that he would recognize them after they became real people. Of course, the person that Krivax most wanted to find was Crossus, but he had no idea what the Archmage actually looked like. Just as Krivax was about to give up looking through the crowd and pull out some bugs to eat while waiting for the duel to begin, he was nearly thrown from his seat in shock by a voice speaking up next to him from seemingly thin air. "Vizier Krivax, how are you enjoying your arrangements?" Archmage Runeweaver asked calmly, having approached Krivax sometime while he was distracted. "I apologize, but this is the best we could do on such short notice given your physiology." "Archmage Runeweaver, I wasn't expecting to see you here," said Krivax, widening his mandibles together in a gesture of surprise. After their initial tour, he hadn't seen very much of the Archmage given that someone as important as him obviously had more important things to do than babysit their delegation. "Well, I do find myself feeling a bit guilty for failing to ease tensions between Vizier Hadix and Arcanist Flame Trail during their argument. You are members of a diplomatic delegation, after all. Though to be honest, I also find myself curious about the results of this bout," the Archmage admitted. "We rarely get to host mages outside of Dalaran and Quel'Thalas after all. It would be interesting to see how our peoples compare in magical combat." "I doubt there is anything that you could have done to interrupt the argument after it had already started, Archmage," Krivax said genuinely, understanding his mentor well enough to know that he wouldn't have listened to the Archmage. "As for the match, what do you think about Arcanist Flame Trail's chances?" "While he did not earn his rank and position lightly, I can say with confidence," said the Archmage, creating a chair-shaped arcane structure with a wave of his hand and sitting down next to him, the previous seats having been removed due to the Nerubian's needs. "While he is not an Archmage, he is still a member of the Kirin Tor and was made a teacher because of his experience and study of wards of nearly all kinds. I hear he even knows a thing or two about the defenses of Quel'Thalas itself, the most potent in the known world. That is most likely why he took Vizier Hadix's criticism over his skills and knowledge so personally." "Do you know if he has any experience in combat?" asked Krivax, curious about the mage who had challenged his mentor. "I don't know," Runeweaver admitted easily. "Quel'Thalas does not share information like that about their mages easily, for all that we are likely the kingdom with the best relations with them, but it is very likely that he has." The elves have been at war with the Zulamani, forest trolls, for most of their existence, much longer than the human kingdoms have stood. This means that many of their magisters have no lack of practice when it comes to combat and centuries if not millennia to hone their skill. It does not matter how much experience the little elf has, interrupted Vizier Krines, not bothering to look up from her notes. The gap in ability between him and Vizier Hadix is simply too vast for him to overcome. As you say, Vizier Krines, said Archmage Runeweaver, obviously not taking her words to heart. Given that he didn't have any experience with Hadix, it wasn't surprising that the Archmage was just writing her words off as arrogant blustering. Krivax and Runeweaver made small talk about the upcoming duel for the next several minutes before he had the idea of asking the Archmage if he could point out important figures in the crowd. The man didn't see any particular problem with it, given that most of these figures would be meeting with their delegation in the future, and easily agreed. Unfortunately, while Runeweave pointed out many people in the crowd, Krivax found that he didn't recognize any of their names. Just as he was beginning to lose hope of seeing any lore-important individuals, the Archmage spotted a particular elf on the far side of the stadium. I could have sworn Keld Ozad would have shown up. He must be busy with his experiments, muttered the Archmage before raising his eyebrows in surprise. Oh, I wasn't expecting to see Prince Kael'thas without his usual escort. Krivax immediately turned to where the Archmage was gesturing and saw an elf man looking effortlessly handsome, as most elvish men did but this one especially so, dressed in an ornate, red robe, and leaning back comfortably in his seat. He seemed to be chatting amiably with a middle-aged human man sitting in the seat next to him, who Runeweaver identified as one Archmage Drendon, and looking exactly like a man that didn't have a care in the world. It was hard to believe from looking at him now that in a potential future this guy would go nuts on Feljuice, and still would if Krivax's actions didn't change things for the better. Krivax was just about to ask Runeweaver to tell him more about Kael'thas when he was interrupted by the sudden activation of the enchantments on the stadium's walls. Krivax watched in amazement as a massive arcane barrier slowly rose to separate the audience from the dueling arena. It didn't take long after that before Vizier Hadix and Arcanist Flametrail were both teleported into the barrier, causing chatter among the audience to immediately pick up. Then a magically amplified voice rang out across the stadium, its source unknown but its function not in doubt. In accordance with the rules and regulations of Dalaran in regards to the matter of duels of honor, let it be known that Arcanist Flametrail of Quel'Thalas and Dalaran has legally and fairly brought forward a challenge to Vizier Hadix of Azjol Nerub, of which the latter has freely accepted. The stakes of this duel have been decided by the former and state that should Arcanist Flametrail prove victorious that Vizier Hadix must apologize for insults given. While Vizier Hadix has not given any terms for victory, the nameless announcer explained to the audience, causing the crowd to grow quiet. The announcer seemed to remain quiet for several moments, allowing everyone to absorb the information before their voice rang out across the stadium once again. This is a duel until one side surrenders or is unable to continue battling, with every effort to be made from both participants to refrain from intentional killing blows or the use of forbidden magics within this contest of skill. The usage of magical items is expressly forbidden. Do you accept these terms? The announcer asked the aforementioned participants. Upon the honor of my house, I accept these terms, Arcanist Flametrail readily agreed, his voice also magically amplified, most likely by the magics of the arena itself. I agree to these terms, said Vizier Hadix shortly, his voice cold and firm as he stared down at his opponent. Then, without further ado, let the duel commence. The announcer yelled out, signaling the start of the fight. The moment that the announcer finished speaking, Arcanist Flametrail didn't hesitate to immediately send a massive ball of fire flying across the arena. The pyroblast was far bigger than anything that Krivax could have produced, and it was cast quicker than he had thought possible. However, Vizier Hadix seemed far less impressed than Krivax felt, as he merely scoffed derisively and shattered the enormous fireball into 3 streams of flame that he sent flying back to his opponent from multiple different angles. The Vizier let out an appreciative hum as the flames dissipated harmlessly the moment they impacted a shimmering ward surrounding the elf, who cast a spell that caused multiple identical images of himself to appear throughout the arena. Clever. It seems that Flametrail has mixed multiple mirror images with his illusions. Something like that takes more than a little skill, muttered Runeweaver, sounding reluctantly impressed. "What's the difference between a mirror image and an illusion?" asked Krivax, beginning to feel a little worried as he watched all the magically created imitations begin casting a spell. "An illusion is just that, an illusion created by a mage that is incapable of affecting the real world," the Archmage explained, not pulling his eyes away from the fight. "A mirror image, on the other hand, is a replication of a mage that possesses the genuine ability to cast magic, albeit in a reduced form and at a high cost in mana. Casting both at the same time makes it difficult for an enemy to discern which attacks are real and which are fake, and all this on top of trying to figure out which one is the real caster." As if to emphasize the Archmage's point, every single image finished casting the moment he was done speaking, resulting in a massive barrage of fireballs simultaneously flying toward Hadix from every possible direction. Krivax could feel the intense heat from where he was sitting, even through the stadium's barrier. He was certain that if it were him in Vizier Hadix's position, then the only possible result would be him becoming a very crispy spider. He could feel his worry for his mentor grow. That worry proved unnecessary, however, as the massive barrage of fireballs passed through Hadix as if he wasn't even there, smashing into random parts of the arena instead. Most of them were indeed illusions, but several of them burst into explosions of fire that disrupted several of the Arcanist's illusions. "It seems Flame Trail isn't the only one who enjoys using illusions," said Runeweaver, sounding slightly surprised. "That was masterfully done. Not even I managed to detect it until it was disrupted. And to cast an invisibility spell at the same time, that's not easily done." Sure enough, the image of Vizier Hadix flickered and dissipated, seeming to leave the images of Flame Trail standing in the arena alone. To his credit, Arcanist Flame Trail didn't hesitate to begin constructing a magical barrier around himself, but his efforts were immediately shown to be useless. Exclamations of surprise could be heard throughout the stadium as Vizier Hadix seemed to appear from under Flame Trail, the ground of the arena flowing around him as if it were mud as he ascended from below. The Vizier grabbed the surprised elf with all four of his hands and lifted him off the ground before pulling him toward his arachnid face, mandibles open wide. Krivax had never seen a person lose all color in their face faster than Arcanist Flame Trail did. He was certain that it would be a long time before the elf let down the shriek of fear he let out as he hastily teleported himself to the other side of the stadium. Hadix, on the other hand, seemed to be in much better spirits, if his mocking laughter was any indication. "How dare you?" shouted Flame Trail, his expression twisting from one of fear to deep anger. Vizier Hadix didn't bother to respond, other than by casting a quick spell before stomping on the ground with both of his forward feet, causing the stadium to shake as the earth cracked and spikes of earth rose to skewer all of the illusions and mirror images. "What a powerful display of geomancy! How is that possible?" exclaimed Runeweaver as he rose from his seat, his eyes growing wide. Arcane magic lent itself to easy manipulation of fire and ice for reasons that Krivax didn't fully understand. Maybe arcane magic just lent itself to temperature regulation, but manipulating the earth was much harder and was generally something much more common among shamans. However, as Jalnerub was an underground kingdom and thus had a lot of motivation to develop their ability to manipulate the earth via arcane means, Archmage Runeweaver wasn't the only one who was surprised. Flame Trail also seemed to be stunned as he looked around at the multiple spikes of earth rising out of the ground. Hadix didn't seem interested in giving his opponent a chance to recover as he once again opened his mandibles wide, allowing a huge swarm of hissing locusts to emerge from his mouth and fly across the stadium in the elf's direction. Flame Trail yelled out what Krivax assumed was a Thalassian swear word and frantically threw a stream of fire at the swarm, revealing it to have been an illusion and causing it to dissipate. The mage seemed to show an expression of relief, which instantly became panic as two intertwined orbs of arcane magic came flying through his flames and smashed into his body, knocking him off his feet and sending him tumbling across the ground. Krivax was impressed to see that Flame Trail actually managed to cast a shielding spell while rolling across the ground that saved him from the next barrage of arcane magic that followed immediately afterward. "Oh. For a moment I believed that your people were actually able to summon swarms of man-eating insects at will," muttered the Archmage, sounding a mixture of relieved and tired as he sat back down. "No. But I do know some spider lords who like carrying them around on their person," Krivax idly mentioned as he watched the very exciting fight. "Of course you do." From that point onward, Flame Trail focused almost completely on defense, leveraging his expertise in warding magic to survive an onslaught of spells coming from Vizier Hadix. This eventually resulted in the elf panting in exhaustion as he stood inside an impressive barrier of arcane energy. Flame trail's almost completely out of mana. But if that barrier is as powerful as it looks, I wouldn't count him out yet, said Runeweaver, leaning forward in his seat. Why's that, Archmage? Asked Krivax. Things seem pretty hopeless for him from my perspective. Just as Runeweaver was about to answer, Flame Trail brought both of his palms together and closed his eyes. Krivax had no idea what the mage was doing at first, but he was soon able to understand when Flame Trail began to breathe in a strange pattern and a vortex of mana started swirling around the elf. Flame Trail is using a technique called evocation, explained Runeweaver without prompting. It allows for a mage to regenerate a large amount of mana in a very short amount of time. It's normally not something that is safe to use during combat, for obvious reasons, but this might be the perfect scenario. If he manages to regain all of his mana, then he'll be in a much better position to fight Vizier Hadix, who's likely running low on mana himself by now. Krivax doubted that Flame Trail would be able to win, even if he did regain all his mana, but as soon as he saw Vizier Hadix pull out the spell weave he had been working on earlier, he knew that he wasn't going to be able to find out. The silk glowed brightly with arcane energy, and was woven into a shape similar to what most people would usually expect from a spider web. If this is the extent of your capabilities, then I see no reason to continue this farce, said Hadix, throwing the silk into the air. Krivax watched in amazement as the silk immediately expanded into a massive web-shaped dome that surrounded both him and Arcanist Flame Trail. Its effects were immediate as the vortex of mana that was previously circling around Flame Trail began to fly off on its own and into the web. Pieces of Flame Trail's barrier began to crack like glass and also began floating toward the web. What is this? Shouted the panicking Flame Trail, immediately using some of the mana he had regained to throw a ball of fire at Hadix. The fireball barely reached a few feet before redirecting itself into the web, dissipating harmlessly the moment it made contact. This is something of my own creation, said Hadix, sounding smug. Simply put, any magic you cast while under its effects will find itself stuck in my web, so to speak. Impossible. Flame Trail frantically threw spell after spell at Hadix and even tried running out of the magical web barrier, but every spell he cast was useless and he barely managed to get himself unstuck the first time he tried physically touching the web. It wasn't long before Flame Trail was once again completely exhausted, but this time without any barriers to protect him from the telekinetically thrown rock that smashed into his stomach, sending him doubling over in pain. You cannot win. Concede while you are still conscious enough to do so, said Vizier Hadix, fully prepared to follow through on his threat. Arcanist Flame Trail snarled in rage and shot a furious expression toward Hadix, but after a few moments he seemed to collect himself and realize that he had no other options. I concede. And thus the duel is decided. The victor, Vizier Hadix of Azjol Nerub, declared the magical announcer the second after Flame Trail conceded, the arcane barrier around the arena lowering and magical letters projected into the air spelling out the winner's name for all to see. And despite one of their own losing, Krivax watched as the stands exploded into cheers at the impressive display of magical combat, even the Archmage next to him standing and giving a respectful applause. Told you, Vizier Krina's smug voice sounded out as she also raised and followed the crowd's lead by giving her colleague a polite round of clapping as well. As for Hadix, he simply took everything in with a huff and made his way to the exit while his opponent picked himself up and did the same with as much grace as he could, likely off to see a healer about his many bruises. All the while Krivax cheered for his teacher, a new level of respect welling up inside him. And here is the room that you'll be waiting in until the Council of Six is ready to see you, said the friendly receptionist lady with a smile, gesturing to the open door that they had been led to. Krivax followed the other viziers as they walked past the receptionist, a female gnome, and took a quick look around the waiting room. After seeing nothing of note aside from the enchanted cushions that had been prepared for them, he turned his attention back to the receptionist and asked her how long it would take for the council to be ready to see them. I shouldn't be very long, said the receptionist reassuringly. I'm sure the council is very eager to meet you, given Vizier Hadix's impressive performance during his duel. Once they are ready, I'll come and get you all and bring you to the portal that leads to the Chamber of Air. After exchanging a few pleasantries, The receptionist quietly left and Krivax eagerly made his way over to one of the cushions and lowered himself down. It surprised him a little how well the mages of Dalaran were reacting to the duel between Hadix and Flame Trail, and how much it seemed to improve people's opinion of the delegation. That wasn't to say that everyone treated them poorly before and loved them now, but he had definitely noticed less polite smiles and more genuine interest. Krivax supposed that it made sense that the mages of Dalaran would feel a sense of respect for magical power and knowledge. The enchantments of these cushions are surprisingly complex for something so frivolous, said Krines, staring at her seat as she too made herself comfortable, causing Hadix to mutter something about elves. If this meeting goes well, then perhaps some of our own mages can learn these enchantments and apply them to our silken weaves, said Krivax enthusiastically, imagining the possibility of cocoons even more comfortable than what they had now. If Dalaran is truly that much better than our people at enchantment, then there's a lot we could gain from sending people here to learn. I don't particularly see why Azjol Nerub would need floating silverware or obscenely comfortable cushions, Hadix said testily. Even if you don't have any interest in the enchantments themselves, I'm sure the circle could turn them into something useful, said Krines. Krivax had been surprised to see how the vizier's interest in Dalaran had grown over their stay in the city, and it made him feel hopeful that something productive would come from their coming meeting. After all, if she liked Dalaran and was impressed by it, then wasn't that a good sign that there were other viziers who would feel the same way? Do you believe that the results of the duel will have any effect on this upcoming meeting, Vizier Krines? Asked Krivax, interested in the vizier's perspective. It's possible that they will be more interested in sharing knowledge, after having seen Vizier Hadix's power firsthand, said Krines, her expression thoughtful. But we already assumed that they would be interested in negotiating for a relationship similar to the one they have with the rest kingdoms of these lands. Dalaran was an ostensibly neutral nation that had negotiated agreements that would allow other nations to peacefully send their citizens here to learn magic. Given that the majority of the human kingdom's mages had studied in the city, and the Crown Prince of Quel'Tha Alas himself spent most of his time in Dalaran, the benefits were obvious. After seeing the city themselves, both Krines and Hadix felt confident that the Circle of Viziers would agree to send people to learn in Dalaran. That was one of the reasons that caused Krivax to believe that Dalaran was one of the best hopes for cooperation between Azjol Nerub and the Eastern Kingdoms. Aside from that, the most important topics of discussion will be the creation of a portal and the exchange of magical reagents, Krines continued after a moment of consideration. Do you think you'll be able to create said portal, even with the spatial disturbances caused by the dark portal? Asked Krivax curiously, knowing that Krines had already talked about the dark portal and its disturbances with Antonidas and many other mages. If you had asked me that before we arrived, then I would not have had a good answer for you, answered the vizier, sounding reluctant to admit her own inability. But now that I've studied the nexus of ley lines that this city was built upon and seen some of the reagents they have available, I'm confident that it should not be an issue. Where in Azjol Nerub will the portal lead to? Asked Krivax. In Killer, of course, said Krines, looking at him as if he was stupid for asking. Where else would the portal connect to other than the most magically innovative and magically advanced city in Azjol Nerub? Most magically advanced, perhaps. But most innovative? Inkiller hasn't made any significant innovations in centuries, said Hadix scornfully. Oh? And what innovations have Killer Hook had to offer our kingdom over the past few centuries? I wouldn't remind you that it was one of our own that discovered the existence of the very continent you are standing on. That hardly counts as anything more than luck. Innovations require skill and creativity. If innovations require skill, then I suppose that explains why Inkiller has not produced any. Krivax ignored their argument as he waited for the receptionist to return. He had long since learned that viziers were able to start an argument over the most innocuous of topics and had become accustomed to tuning them out. Thankfully, it didn't take very long before there was a knock on the door and Krivax was looking down at the tiny receptionist. The Council of Six is ready for you all if you'll just come with me. Soon enough, the three viziers were following behind the gnome as she led them up many flights of stairs as they ascended the Violet Citadel to eventually reach an innocuous-looking portal. Seeing no reason to delay, Krivax offered a quick thanks to the receptionist and stepped into the portal. As soon as he shook off the momentary disorientation that always came with so quickly traveling to a new location, Krivax took a look at his surroundings and immediately knew that he was in the right location. The chamber of air was a room without any visible walls, a grey stone floor with the symbol of the Kirin Tor etched into it, and a roof that looked like an open sky shifting rapidly as if time was sped up. The various members of the Council of Six sat in comfortable chairs around the location where they had been teleported into, lacking the usual magical disguises they generally wore when meeting others. At first, the members of the council had wanted to maintain their anonymity during the meeting, but Hadix had made it clear to Antonidas that he wasn't interested in negotiating with mysterious faceless figures. "Welcome, representatives of Azjol Nerub. Although we have already met, I think it's best if my colleagues introduce themselves before we begin this meeting," said Antonidas, who was currently sitting directly to the front of them while offering them a gentle expression. The Grand Magus hadn't argued about the matter for very long, so Krivax assumed that anonymity was not something he cared very much about right now. "If I may, I would like to introduce myself first," said the same elvish man that Krivax had seen yesterday during the duel. He exuded the same relaxed demeanor that Krivax had seen yesterday, and he was once again struck by the fact that this was the man who would go on to become a villain. "I am Kael'thas Sunstrider, Crown Prince of Quel'Thalas. I must say, I was very impressed by your performance yesterday, Vizier Hadix. Arcanist Flametrail was an experienced opponent, yet you defeated him quite handily." "Your appreciation is noted, Elf," Hadix said dryly. Krivax expected the prince to be annoyed by the lackluster reply, but he was surprised when Kael'thas's expression became one of amusement instead. "I believe such topics can wait until after we've finished discussing matters of actual importance," said a middle-aged man with glassy eyes and a severe expression that made him look much more like a villain than Kael'thas. "I am Archmage Kel'Thuzad. I look forward to working with your people and sharing knowledge that will benefit us all." Krivax knew that it wasn't completely fair to judge a person based on their appearance or for things they have not yet done, but something about Kel'Thuzad made him feel like he was looking at a dangerous person who wouldn't mind dissecting him if he could get away with it. "I suppose it's my turn now," said Archmage Runeweaver, who looked much the same as he did yesterday. "I apologize for my deception, but the knowledge of who is a member of the Council of Six is not something that is typically shared. Obviously, this is a rather unique situation." Krivax was a bit surprised to learn that he was a member of the council. There was no way that he could have remembered such a minor character after all, but it made sense once he thought about it. It was in their interest to have one of their own be responsible for guiding them throughout the city and figuring them out in a less official capacity. "I am Archmage Modera," said the only female among the Council of Six, nodding toward them stoically as she introduced herself. "Your duel against Arcanist Flametrail was a masterful display of magical combat, and I look forward to working with you." Krivax didn't know very much about her, other than the fact that she alone among those present would remain on the council far into the future, surviving a lot that her colleagues did not. Except maybe Runeweaver, since he vaguely recalled him being on the council in the future as well, but he wasn't sure. It was the last member that captured his complete attention, and both excited and worried him in equal measure since he now shared a room with the dragon, albeit one currently in a much smaller form. Sitting next to Modera was another elvish man, though one with a slight build, delicate features, and silvery hair streaked with red. Archmage Crossus, otherwise known as Corialstras, future prime consort of the Alexstrasza, the lifebinder and aspect of the Red Dragonflight herself, was not a man who would blend easily into a crowd. He was also the method through which Krivax intended to save Alexstrasza from being captured, so he couldn't help but stare a little. "I am Archmage Crossus," said the elf who was secretly a dragon. "I have heard much about you all from my friends in Capital City, Nerubians. I look forward to learning more about your people." Krivax was sure that he had heard about the Nerubians from more than just a few friends in Capital City. After all, Wimrest Temple did reside on Northrend, and he was sure the dragons knew more about the Nerubians than the people of the Eastern Kingdoms. "Now that introductions have been made, let us move on to the first and most important topic of discussion," said Antonidas, his tone taking on a seriousness that it lacked before. "The Magocracy of Dalaran would like to officially extend an invitation to the Kingdom of Azjol Nerub to send some of its citizens to learn in our city. This is an arrangement that would benefit both of our people greatly, and would allow for the exchange of ideas and knowledge and foster a peaceful relationship between us." It would also grant you a significant amount of diplomatic legitimacy within the minds of the nations of these lands, said Kel'Thuzad, pointing out the pragmatic benefits. Most nobles prefer to keep their heirs close, but more than a few of them send their less important children here to learn. Archmage Kel'Thuzad's words are true. If distasteful, Croesus said reluctantly. The improvement of your reputation in Dalaran means the improvement of your reputation throughout the Eastern Kingdoms. Phrase it however you like, it doesn't change the fact that cooperation with Dalaran is entirely to their benefit, Kel'Thuzad responded while rolling his eyes. The exact details would need to be negotiated with the Circle of Viziers, but after seeing your city for myself, I'm sure they would be somewhat interested in your offer, said Vizier Krines, willing to speak up for the delegation now that they were talking about a topic that actually interested her. However, if you truly wish for them to accept, there are a few ways that you could make the deal a little more enticing. There are many who would view such a deal unfavorably due to the increased risk of outsiders learning our more valuable magics. At the vizier's words, Krivax mentally settled in for a long negotiation. Very well then, said Antonidas, nodding as this was the result he was expecting all along. In that case, let's talk about the details. If you were to offer us guarantees that all of your techniques in enchanting would be shared with our students, without exception, then I'm sure the Circle of Viziers would look at your offer much more favorably, said Vizier Krines, sounding for all the world as if the proposal she just gave was reasonable. Ha! How bold of you, Vizier Krines, said Kael'thas, chuckling in amusement. Dalaran's expertise in enchanting comes from Quel'Thalas. Most of the city's greatest enchanters are Kaldor'i, who are given strict guidelines for what can be shared. Are you certain that you should be negotiating with Dalaran, and not us? Given that you, the heir to your people's kingdom, are a member of Dalaran's ruling council, I'm not sure that the distinction particularly matters in this case, Krines said sardonically. It is entirely within your power to change those guidelines, presumably, and if only most of this city's decent enchanters are elves, then that leaves some that are not. Our mastery over enchanting is a skill that we have worked hard on to grow over thousands of years, so you must think us truly foolish if you believe that we would hand over such knowledge so easily, said Kael'thas, pulling his gaze away from Krines and turning his attention to Hadix. Perhaps if you would be willing to share your knowledge of how to use geomancy with arcane magic, we could be persuaded to share a portion of what we know. Humph, not likely. While our mastery in geomancy is also something that we have grown over millennia, it is worth far more than learning how to make self-cleaning brooms, Hadix said firmly. If not your geomancy, then Azjol-Nerub could also offer us information about Northrend, said Croesus, acting to mediate between the two. I was very interested when I heard that your people shared information about the dragons with scholars in Capital City, or maybe you might be more interested in agreeing to supply Dalaran with your people's silk. The negotiations went on for quite some time, with each side doing its best to get the most favorable agreement that they could. As Krivax watched the discussions, he was suddenly very glad that Vizier Krines had grown an interest in Dalaran and had decided to take over the bulk of the negotiations, and that nobody was expecting him to match wits with the archmages. That would have been an abject disaster. Eventually, they settled on an agreement in which Azjol-Nerub would send students to learn magic in Dalaran, including some tutoring in Kaldor'i enchanting. In exchange, Azjol-Nerub would send a few of its mages to offer lessons in geomancy and warding, with the understanding that they wouldn't be sharing everything that they knew. Valuable magical reagents that could only be found in the Eastern Kingdoms would be traded for Nerubian silk and Northrend-based reagents, although they would need to arrange for experts to properly value these items before they could agree on proportions. Dalaran tried to argue for Azjol-Nerub to assist them in researching and exploring Northrend's surface in exchange for a reciprocal agreement for the Eastern Kingdoms, but Krines successfully argued that such an agreement would be lopsided. After all, the Eastern Kingdoms were well explored and there were many nations they could negotiate an agreement with if Azjol-Nerub found something they wanted to research. The council eventually sweetened the deal when Antonidas himself offered to assist Krines in the creation of the portal to Northrend and pay for the costs associated with the ritual. Finally, Krivax muttered under his breath, I'm glad that's done with. Now that we've reached an agreement, all that's left is to discuss the logistics of the matter, said Antonidas. Damn it. What followed was a long discussion where they went over the logistical details of having Nerubians stay in Dalaran to learn. Apparently, The nation that was sending their students would be expected to be the ones to fund their education. It made sense. The non-magical citizens of Dalaran would not exactly be happy if they were the ones being taxed to fund the education of foreigners. This wasn't a large issue for a nation like Azjol-Nerub, which almost had more resources than they knew what to do with. They also discussed where the Nerubians would be staying, given that they had much different body types and required significantly different living conditions compared to the other sapient races. Do you really believe it's necessary for your people to have their own enclave like the elves do? I don't disagree with you given the circumstances, but it would be quite the project, said Modera, her expression thoughtful as she considered the issue. Our current accommodations are not nearly large enough to comfortably house members of the Queen or Spider Lord castes, explained Hadix. Besides, I've watched more than enough humans quiver at the sight of me to know how much our appearances unsettle you all. I'm curious about your resistance to the idea of us living in our own area. Segregating you from the rest of the city is counterproductive to the goal of fostering connections between our people. I am not fond of Quel'th Allah's enclave either, although I recognize that this is for the best, said Crossus, sounding reluctant still. Archmage Modera is correct to say that this will be a significant endeavor, especially if your people prefer to live underground. It would be easier if we could hire workers from Ironforge, said Runeweaver, sounding grim as he reminded everyone of the situation down south. But given the circumstances, with our assistance, that shouldn't be much of an issue, said Krivax, receiving a nod of agreement when he looked to his mentor. The Jormunga make the construction of tunnels a simple matter. Jormunga? Enormous worm-like creatures with crystalline spines along their flanks that we use to dig out tunnels. With such creatures, it would indeed be much easier to dig the tunnels necessary to house our new students, said Modera. Although we would have to be careful about digging your tunnels into the underbelly. The underbelly? Questioned Crenus, her expression one of befuddlement. The underbelly is an informal name for the city's sewer system, Kel'Thuzad explained evenly. It contains a growing slum, home to Dalaran's less fortunate citizens, and is infested with giant rats, magical runoff from countless experiments, creatures that spawn from said runoff, and goblins, who willingly choose to live there. Krivax was surprised to hear that the underbelly was a real place. He remembered the area from the lore, but an underground sewer slum seemed like such a ridiculous thing to exist in real life. If your sewers are infested with unwanted residents, then why haven't you cleared them out? Hadix asked curiously. We have, repeatedly, but as long as the conditions that created the underbelly in the first place continue to exist, then it will simply continue to reform, explained Runeweaver, audibly frustrated with the situation. At this point, the underbelly is large enough that if we were to dismantle it, the consequences would be significant. It's simply easier to let it and those in it be, only occasionally sending exterminators down there when the vermin population grows too large and threatens to spill out onto the surface. That made both viziers cringe at the plain inefficiency of it all, something Krivax agreed with but also knew not all societies were as structured as Azjol-Nerub. One other matter that we've failed to touch upon is potential membership into the Kirin Tor, said Antonidas, blatantly changing the subject. There is much information we cannot share with those who are not members of the Kirin Tor, but such benefits come with significant responsibilities. Those that become members are expected to keep secrets, and while we would not expect anyone to act against the interests of their home nation, members of the Kirin Tor are expected to support Dalaran. More specifically, Dalaran has pledged itself to assist the other nations in defeating the Horde, if they ever manage to actually stop arguing and form their little alliance, said Kel'Thuzad with a disapproving grunt. Any of your people who join the Kirin Tor would be expected to assist in that goal. Would any of your people be interested in such an arrangement? Asked Antonidas, staring directly at Hadix without any subtlety. The viziers glanced at each other with matching expressions of consideration before Crenus took the initiative to respond. That is something that the Circle of Viziers would need to discuss extensively, said Crenus. It would help if you were to fully explain the responsibilities that a member of the Kirin Tor would hold to your city. Of course, said Antonidas with an easygoing shrug. Aside from the ones already mentioned, a member of the Kirin Tor would be expected to defend the city when it is attacked, perform certain administrative duties, and teach a certain amount of advanced magical classes per month. Naturally, Those teaching sessions can be deferred if the individual provides progress reports of certain magical research. Members of the Kirin are expected to teach? Asked Krivax, unable to stop himself from glancing at Crossus. They are, said Antonidas, glancing at Krivax curiously. We have too few mages capable of teaching certain subjects, so such a system is a necessity. Why do you ask? Would you like to attend some of these lessons? I would, Archmage Antonidas, said Krivax, jumping at the opportunity. My mentor is more than capable of teaching me what I need to know, but I would be a fool to turn down the opportunity to attend the lessons of such accomplished mages. More like I want to know when Crossus is teaching a lesson so that I can send a skitterer to stalk him and find out where he lives. Krivax knew that Haedix wasn't the type of teacher to get jealous, and would only approve of him seeking to learn more on his own, so he wasn't concerned about his reaction. Very well, said Antonidas, sounding amused by the blatant flattery. I will arrange for you to be sent a schedule of the lessons, and be given permission to attend. After that, Antonidas turned his attention back to Crinus to continue his explanation of the duties of a member of the Kirin. Once they were done, the vizier nodded her understanding and promised to bring the matter to the circle of viziers. Soon enough, they managed to finish discussing everything they could, and the negotiations were brought to an end. As he stepped back through the portal that would take him out of the chamber of air, Krivax couldn't help but feel optimistic. Not only had the delegation managed to negotiate a favorable agreement with another government, but Krivax have come across an opportunity to advance his personal goals. Today was a productive day,